the big problem is if there is not an objective reality of which each individual is a part and of which each individual can know a small part to a small degree by their perception. But if we say that there are really distinct realities, then immediately you also destroy the concept of truth, because truth means a correct description of reality. But if there is not one common reality, then there is also no one truth. But then you hear people say these things like, I have my truth and you have your truth. And of course from this it then also follows that you cannot have a concept of good and evil or right and wrong, because everybody would just have their own moral views. And so part of what I feel is happening here is that people are elevating their own perception or their own perception to reality itself, and they are elevating their own opinion to truth itself. And so it seems kind of a very arrogant thing to do in one sense, but also I think it's very destructive, because you can't really have a conversation with other people if there is not a common reality and a common truth to which you can refer. And so I feel almost as if and I feel you cannot really live by this philosophy that you are espousing, because of course you still eat bread in the morning and ride your bicycle to the train station. You don't try to eat your bicycle, for example, or just wonder what the hell you should do, because so you cannot really live like this. But I feel almost as if there is some conscious or unconscious motivation behind presenting such an absurd philosophy, and that motivation would be kind of like a Marxist motivation to destroy the structure of the society in which you live.
Yes, I would agree with those points that you made there. So one could sort of point out primarily that, well, this idea of separate realities that might contradict each other is necessarily wrong. It contradicts truth that we know, that self-evident truths. I mean, the very definition of reality is how things really are, how things really exist, in what condition the world around us is organized or structured, you could say. And therefore, it follows necessarily that all parts of reality must be consistent with one another. So therefore, it's impossible to have subjective realities. It's really just destroying the meaning of the word reality, basically. And it's therefore necessarily and self-evidently wrong. And also, yes, no one really believes it, as you pointed out. Everyone in their everyday lives assume that there is this external world around us that we have to relate to, and we have to attempt to correct our own views in conformity with that reality and act based upon that reality. Like you mentioned, every time we nourish ourselves, every time we obtain water, hydration, every time we go to school or job or do anything, we are always assuming that there is this reality that we are engaging, we are interacting, and that's necessarily the case. And even just dialogue itself assume a common reality. So if some person says to another person, well, there isn't really an objective common reality, we all have our own different realities, well, that's really very strange. It's what some would call a performative contradiction. The idea that you are saying something, but by the act of saying it, you are denying what you're saying. Because by dialoguing with someone or discussing or debating with someone, you are, of course, assuming that we are both present in a common reality in which we can speak to each other and we can communicate with each other. And you will receive my messages vocally and I will receive your messages vocally through this intermedium of this common reality. So just saying that or writing that is a denial of the content of that claim. So yes, it's necessarily wrong and self-refuting, you could point out. And yes, I think it seems to be a part of this this modern liberal or very individualistic idea that the individual is sort of exalted above everything else, that the individual has the right to determine its own reality, so to speak, which is absurd in its very wording. And making the individual self as some sort of God. It reminds me of what Matt Walsh, that political commentator in the United States, said when he tried to define leftism. He defined it as the worship of the self. And that, I think, makes sense when we see all of the different things that leftism does. And also it would explain this idea of perception of the individual being sort of infallibly true for himself. So, yes, it's not only is it false and self-evidently false and self-refuting, but it's also destructive and I would say also immoral, because it denies the dignity that things have in objective reality. It elevates human perception far above its natural dignity, trying to treat yourself as a god, and that is immoral, because you cannot treat a creature like God. That's actually blasphemy. And you could also point out, as you said, that it denies any idea of right and wrong. It reduces that to meaningless words. And yes, it's something that people cannot possibly embrace.
Yeah, good points that you mentioned there. I like that you brought up the definition, and definition of reality would be that which exists, or the things that really exist, or a description of reality would therefore be describing how things really are. And that necessarily encompasses all of the things that exist. And so if you say that there are multiple different realities, then you have introduced a contradiction directly into the definition of the term. And we have touched on this idea once before in another conversation, that when you insert a contradiction directly into the definition of a fundamental term, and there isn't any term which is more fundamental than reality, because everything happens inside of it. And so by inserting this contradiction, you have basically, you kind of make it impossible to have a logical dialogue about anything, because you can always use the one part of the contradiction to contradict the other and vice versa. And so you can never make any statement on which you then have to stick with. And so I guess this is really the point of trying to corrupt this very, and Jordan Peterson talks about the logos, and how the logos is the fundamental mechanism by which we can communicate to find out what is true and to basically deal with reality. And some very radical leftist kind of Marxist postmodern thinkers call the West a phallogocentric patriarchy, and so they say that the logos is actually a bad thing, and they link it with the patriarchy, which they also call a bad thing, and they profess the aim to destroy these two things. And by inserting a contradiction into the most fundamental definition, you actually achieve the destruction of the logos quite brilliantly, because now you can no longer speak about anything, basically, because every statement could also be true or false based on this contradiction. So I think that's a very important point here.
Right, yes. All rational dialogue and discussion and debate will be destroyed, because if there is no common reality to refer to, then all statements become meaningless. Everything becomes chaotic. Nothing makes sense anymore by definition. So it's destroying the basis of everything in philosophy and dialogue and discussion. So it cuts right through the core of things that we all have to accept as real and true. So yes, that's certainly the case. And of course, many people could point out how this leads to absurd conclusions that I think very few people would be willing to accept, or perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps there are a great number of people who would say this absurd conclusion that, for instance, someone would say, well, if that is really the case, then you would have to say that we can't say that the Earth is round. We have to say perhaps the Earth is flat for some people and the Earth is round for other people. We could never say that it's objectively true that the Earth is round, or that the moon exists, or that the sun exists, or that Australia exists, or that Germany exists. And then, I mean, that's just one of many ways to point out the absurdity, even though I'd say that just saying the idea that there are subjective realities that can contradict each other, it's itself absurd. But of course, you can also point out these conclusions. So, yeah, I think that's worth pointing out. And one could, I suppose, relate this false view to this idea of radical skepticism. The idea that we can't know anything with certainty, that everything can be questioned, everything can be disputed, and there is no way to prove that something is true in actual objective reality, because you could always dispute the premises behind that argument or whatever you present in favor of that view. And that would also, of course, be completely destructive, and it would destroy not only its own statement, because that's another thing, it's self-refuting to say we can't know anything for certain. Well, are you certain that we can't know anything for certain? Is it objectively true that we can't know anything for certain? Well, then you are making claims about objective reality, so it's self-refuting in that way. But it's that's also destructive, because also there we cannot debate anything or discuss anything. Everything becomes impossible. So that's also a view that has to be combated, the idea that, oh no, we can't know anything for certain. No, that's false. We can actually have access to reality and know certain things. That, of course, doesn't mean that we will know everything about reality, of course not. But there are some things that we can know and safely believe, in other words, and know to be true.
Yes, and and I guess this is an assumption or an axiom that you have to hold if you want to be able to exist in the world and to live. Because as we have said, if you were truly a radical skeptic, then you couldn't interact with the world, because whenever you were hungry, you would have to say, well, I don't actually know if I'm really hungry or if I just feel hungry. Or when you want to eat a piece of bread, you would have to say, I don't know if this bread is edible or not. It might have changed. So it's really, yeah, it's not practicable. And you made two good statements before that I wanted to quickly just kind of follow up on. And the first is that it's actually also a performative contradiction to say to another person that there isn't such a thing as objective reality, because you would basically then have to say, well, either this other person is just a figment of my imagination, or how should a message be transferred, and how could another part of your imagination tell you something which you didn't already know before? So the concept of speaking with someone doesn't really make sense, I guess, in this statement. And I guess also a very important point of this whole thing is this idea of making the individual itself into God. So because you kind of take your own perception and you say, no, this is not just my perception of a bigger thing, something which is bigger than me, but this is actually the whole reality. So I am the master of the entire reality, and also my conviction is the same as the truth. And so, yeah, Jordan Peterson said in some place that this is kind of the mental state of a 2-year-old, because when children go above the age of 2, they typically start to interact with other children on the playground, and that is where they have to learn that they themselves do not define reality, because the other child might object and not be willing to play a certain game in a certain way, and so you have to negotiate the game you are playing as a child so that the other children are willing to play with you as well. And so that's kind of the first point where you definitely have to learn that reality is not just what you perceive or want it to be, but there are things outside of you that influence you. And of course, as you grow older, you should learn this more and more, that you have to adapt yourself to reality. And everybody knows this. That's why it's so frustrating. Like, if it's raining outside, you take a raincoat or an umbrella when you go out. You don't just think, oh no, I will just not believe that it's raining and then I will be dry or something like that. So you know perfectly well that you have to adapt yourself to reality. And yeah, so I guess these are some important thoughts.
Yes, indeed. And also with those viewpoints, one could never say things like, today I learned something new. No one can learn anything. There is no basis for education or any kind of learning, any kind of knowledge. One could never say that, say, people who study physics, they don't have any more knowledge about the nature of matter and particles than some peasant in the 15th century. Because you can never learn anything about objective reality. According to that view, so it becomes completely absurd. And also this idea I've heard that when you point out, perhaps that this is when you point out that it's a performative contradiction to say, oh, we can't know anything or we have our own realities, well, then of course that's a contradiction, because you're assuming that in the very act of speaking or saying those words. Well, some would, I suppose, say, and there are some who believe this, that, well, we simply talk to each other and assume this for the sake of convenience. It's pragmatic that we assume a common reality because that's practical. We wouldn't get very far without it. Well, first of all, you could ask why. Why is it pragmatic? Why is it practical and useful and convenient to assume a common reality? How do you know that that would actually help the discussion? Only if there is a common reality which would make it practical. Because on what basis do you say this is practical and this is not, if there isn't some objective fact about the nature of discussion as such? So that also becomes a self-fulfilling idea, this idea that, oh, it's only practical or pragmatic. No, it doesn't make sense, because also then you're assuming, well, what is the basis for that practicality or pragmatic nature? Again, reality. So
yes, it's an important point that you made there, that you cannot learn something new if you assume that your perception is reality, is synonym to reality, or the content of your consciousness is equal to reality. Because yeah, you cannot then learn something, because learning means that something comes into your consciousness, but then it must have come from somewhere. And so it must have already been there, in which case you would have already known it. And in the same token, you also cannot change your mind, because, well, how should that exactly work? Where should the change come from? What should affect the change if there is nothing except that which you yourself already contain? And I guess I was thinking just before, because it's very frustrating and annoying to talk with these kind of people, and it doesn't lead anywhere. I guess perhaps the right reaction would be to simply say, look, I do not talk with people who think that I do not exist as an individual entity. I will not be willing to have a conversation if you do not grant me moral agency and individual existence outside of your consciousness. I will just not be willing to have this sort of interaction.
Interesting point. One of these philosophies that would entail such a thing is solipsism, which is this idea that only you exist. You are the only agent in reality, and everything you see around you is a figment of your imagination, or at least something that exists within your mind. Sort of like the only thing that is reality is you, who is sort of I suppose, some sort of God, who just has some ideas, and that's all reality is, basically, it seems to me, according to solipsism. And yes, I mean, if someone says, well, I am a solipsist, one could say, well, okay, then I suppose we can't have a conversation then, because I don't exist, in your view. So that's an interesting point. Thanks for a good discussion, guys. Yeah, thank you very much for that comment.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and the interesting point is you cannot disprove solipsism or rational skepticism. You cannot disprove it because they have a different axiom at the start of their thinking. But I think I totally agree with what you were saying. You should just say to such a person, yeah, well then, I guess we won't have a conversation because you don't even believe that I exist. And so I guess part of the problem, and I'm prone to this myself, is being too agreeable and putting up with completely absurd statements by other people and treating them with the respect that you would treat a conversation partner who makes sensible statements. Because actually what you should just say is, this is absurd, and yeah, I cannot have a conversation with you on this ground, and that's the end. Or one thing I was also thinking about, which I wouldn't advise it, but I still think it would be very funny, if you would just get up and slap this person in the face. They would probably be very upset. And then you could say, well, why are you upset? In my reality, nothing bad has happened. So again, people don't live by what they say, and when you treat them in conversation still as if they are intelligible conversation partners, then I think you're kind of doing something wrong yourself at that point.
Yeah, what you could say about the idea of slapping someone in the face is that according to the perspective that there is an objective reality, you could make an argument that, well, that would contradict human dignity. But if you believe that there is no common reality, it's just subjective so-called realities, well, then you lack a basis on which to object. So one who believes in objective reality, well, we can have an argument why that's not good, but not the one who denies it. So yes, that's a good point. And yes, it involves absurdities on several levels. That's very true. So yes, one has to admit then that there is an objective reality. We can discover how it is. We can acquire knowledge about it, and that's something everyone assumes in their everyday lives, and we know it to be the case. So I hope that people would simply be honest about it in also what they profess to believe in. So
let's perhaps, if I may, quickly deal with the question of, because I agree with what you have just said, so what would be the motivation for people to make such statements? Since they can't truly rationally believe it or live by it, what is the motivation behind it?
That's a very good question. Well, one idea could be that some people, well, I mean, one could sort of say that, well, some people have held on to this view for a time, and they are not humble enough to admit that, oh, they have been really deceived for a long time, so just cling on to that belief because of pride or something. But then you could also ask the question, well, how did they obtain that view in the first place? So it is a good question. I would say that those who sincerely believe that there is no objective reality, they would be blinded in some way, because it's obvious to everyone. Everyone really knows that there is objective reality, so they would be dishonest with themselves, and you could say they are blind in a spiritual way. Exactly the way in which one would be deceived, or what would be the cause of that deception? Well, there would be some bad will on the part of the person not really seeking the truth, not really caring about being honest and rational in his view of thinking. That yes, the person would not be willing to think rationally, would abandon rationality in some things, and that would produce such that would then involve such deception or blindness. Perhaps that would be very general statements about how people could end up like this. But if you're talking about particular, very concrete circumstances, well, I'm not sure. Perhaps some simply do not care about rationality in those cases because they have heard other people in their area or friends or whatever hold this view, and they want to be popular among them, so they hold this view as well. Or some, there could be different reasons, but at least I think it has to do with not being willing to be rational and honest with oneself, and that's a moral problem actually. So
yeah, very good points that you made there, and I particularly agree that that a moral problem lies at the root of it, and it would be something, as you said, like bad will, like not seeking the truth or not seeking goodness, not wanting to be good. And I guess it has something to do like with the denial of responsibility also. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this when he says that if there is no objective reality, then there is no objective truth, and then there is no objective good or evil or obligation or responsibility as an individual. You can just do whatever you want. And so if you don't want to put in the effort and try to be a good human being, then one way to justify that you are not trying it is to make some sort of convoluted philosophical argument, and this would be a prime example of such an escape, like saying, well, there is no objective reality, and so basically I can do whatever I want. I guess that would be one possible motivation for this sort of thing. Of course, as you said, peer pressure might also be a problem. I guess also another motivation that I could see is that people actually want to produce conflict. Because when you destroy the ability of settling disputes or disagreements by speech and by rational interaction and by referring to a common reality and a common set of ethics, then you create conflict, because if the dispute cannot be settled in a civilized and good manner, then it will grow and escalate, and at some point perhaps there will be physical violence, and in the end, as we said, a society cannot function without people accepting a common reality and a common norm of good and evil. And so if you destroy these things, then perhaps you actually hate the society in which you live and you want to destroy it or change it fundamentally, and destroying it would be the first step. And so I guess that would also be a moral failing. That would also be akin to something like bad will or having evil motives for doing what you are doing.
Yes, good point. So I think there is a link between modern leftist revolt against civilization and the denial of objective reality, and also this idea that all people want to be free to do whatever they want and not be held responsible or be willing to humble themselves or correct themselves according to reality, that they simply want to do whatever they want and determine how reality is. It's also a motivation. Yes, I think that is true.
And
so,
if I may, just one short addition, I guess most of the people who hold these views or who speak them out do not consciously have the aim of destroying the entire society or of denying their responsibility. I guess it would more be the case that they are somehow subconsciously drawn towards this philosophy because basically they just want to escape from their responsibility or are not happy with the state of society. But I wouldn't ascribe these motives that I have mentioned consciously to most people who hold or profess such a philosophy. But still, I think that this is the end point to which this philosophy tends. And I guess there are a few select kind of masterminds who actually know that it leads there and who consciously spread it for this purpose. But I guess most of the people who adhere to it in day-to-day life or who profess it wouldn't consciously hold these goals in mind necessarily.
Interesting points. And also an additional comment could be that we see the application of these denials of objective truth in things like transgenderism. The idea that men can be women, women can be men, that she is a woman because she feels like it, and etc. So we also see applications of that to particular issues. By the way, do you think we should move on to some of the topic suggestions that, for instance, Lopez suggested, or do you have some additional thoughts, or what do you think?
Yeah, I would just agree with you that we see many applications of this, let's call it poisonous philosophy that now start to manifest themselves in reality. As you said, transgenderism would be one of these manifestations. I guess we could, and we have named other examples in past conversations. Just not any particular one coming to my mind. But yeah, I guess this would be good for this part, and let's go to the question of philosophy behind geopolitics.